Hello and welcome to module number 3 of PeopleCert Scrum Master I certification training. An introduction to the Scrum framework. This module along with module number 4 will fetch you 10 exam questions equal to 10 marks out of 40. This is an overview or a picture of the overall Scrum framework. Note that the entire course of Scrum 1 is about understanding this framework. So we're not going to cover everything in module 3. We take a higher level look at the Scrum framework at the moment. Scrum has several practices such as roles, events, artifacts, and rules. The rules are not part of the exam syllabus. So we're going to focus only on the roles, events, and artifacts. There are 3 main roles in Scrum: the product owner, Scrum Master, and the development team. Together, they make up the Scrum team. The Scrum events are the sprint or the iteration or the time box, sprint planning, the daily Scrum, sprint execution, sprint review, and sprint retrospective. There's also the product backlog grooming. The Scrum artifacts are the product backlog, sprint backlog, potentially shippable product increment, and information radiators. You will also hear the term release backlog. First, the roles. A role is a set of responsibilities, activities, and authorities granted to a person or a team. For example, a product owner role has a certain responsibilities, activities to perform, and certain authorities given to him or her. Similarly, the Scrum Master and the development team have their own set of responsibilities, set of activities to perform, and certain authorities granted to them. The role is defined in a process or function, and one person or team may have multiple roles. Which means, for example, the Scrum Master is a role, and a single person may be a Scrum Master and at the same time a member of a development team. Though this is not recommended at all, but there may be certain emergency situations. For example, if the Scrum Master is sick or absent for a couple of days, then somebody from the development team may stand in as a Scrum Master in the worst case. Though ideally, we would like to have someone else coming in as an experienced Scrum Master standing in on behalf of the Scrum Master who is absent, rather than moving somebody from the development team to become a temporary Scrum Master. But that's the meaning of how a single person may have multiple roles. As long as the single person performing multiple roles is not in conflict between the roles, it should be okay to perform them, otherwise not. This definition of role on the slide has been taken from Axelos.com from their ITIL publication, the ITIL Glossary of Terms. Though this Glossary of Terms is not a publication reference for the exam, if you're interested, you may want to go through this for your own interest. Summarizing the Scrum roles. There are 3 Scrum roles: the product owner, Scrum Master, and the development team. We're going to take a deeper look into this in the next module, module number 4. The book mentioned at the bottom from Kenneth Rubin, Essential Scrum, A Practical Guide to the Most Popular Agile Process, is a key exam reference. You must go through this book before you write the exam. Though we have brought in concepts from that book throughout our material, it's a good thing to go through the book yourself completely. Scrum events. The prescribed events of Scrum are used in Scrum to create regularity and to minimize the need for meetings not defined in Scrum. All events are time-boxed events such that every event has a maximum duration. A time box means something which must complete in that stipulated time. The time cannot be extended. What are the events in Scrum? We've got several events such as the product backlog grooming, the sprint or the time box to deliver the increment, sprint planning at the beginning of the sprint, the daily scrum, which is a quick meeting every day during the sprint, the execution of the sprint to create the product, and the sprint review, wherein there's a conversation between the customer representatives or the product owner and the development team about the product which was the increment which was delivered, and a lesson learned discussion, which is a sprint retrospective. And the sprint itself includes the sprint planning, the daily scrum, sprint execution, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospective. And it also includes the product backlog grooming at some point during the sprint. Next, we have the artifacts in Scrum. Scrum artifacts provide key information that the Scrum team and the stakeholders need to be aware of for understanding the product under development, the activities being planned, and the activities done in the project. The Scrum artifacts are highlighted on this slide. There are 4 of them: the product backlog, the sprint backlog, the potentially shippable product increment, and the information radiators. We will be covering each of these roles, events, artifacts in detail during the course. On the previous slide, there was a link to this website. Please go through this as well, which has explanation of the Scrum artifacts, while we will be covering them in detail in this training program. Such as the product backlog, sprint backlog, and others. This picture is a walkthrough of the Scrum framework. We will be going through this section by section eventually during this training program. But if you look at it closely just for a moment, you will see that the product backlog is here and the release backlog is here. Release backlog is an additional artifact. And there is the product backlog grooming happening before the sprint planning. And there's a sprint backlog for every sprint. And there's a sprint goal for every sprint along with its definition of done. And the sprint is executed based on the plan and the goal and the backlog. And during the sprint, there is a daily scrum meeting for inspection and adaptation. And at the end of the sprint, and during the sprint, there is also the sprint burn down chart for tracking progress. And during the sprint, there is product testing to ensure that the sprint goal has been achieved. And that will end in the realization of a potentially be shippable product increment. That product increment is taken through the sprint review, where the product is demonstrated to the users. And it is once again inspected and adapted. At the same time, the product backlog is also groomed and the release backlog is also groomed. And immediately after the sprint review, there is a sprint retrospective to learn lessons, once again inspecting and adapting the process. The sprint review is about inspecting and adapting the product, whereas the sprint retrospective is about inspecting and adapting the process of Scrum. We will be covering all these elements or aspects as we progress from one module to another. Empirical process control. What that means is the work needs to be transparent and visible to everyone, to all the concerned stakeholders, that is. And the actual work results are the only true measure of progress. Decisions and functions are fact-based, experience-based, and evidence-based, not based on assumptions or hypotheses. Let us understand this more clearly by discussing the 3 pillars of Scrum, or the 3 pillars of empiricism. For that, we look into this link at the bottom. At scrum.org, we have this discussion on the 3 pillars of empiricism or Scrum. which shows you three bubbles or the three pillars: the transparency, adaptation, and inspection. Transparency is about we all know what is going on as a team. Adaptation is okay to change tactical direction. Inspection is check your work as you do it. Therefore, inspect, and based on the inspection, adapt the work. Here we have the three pillars of Scrum. These are principles that are incorporated into all the roles, events, and artifacts. The three pillars are adaptation, transparency, and inspection. We begin with the basic, the foundation pillar, which is transparency. It means everyone involved in an agile project has open access to information, creating a trust-enriched environment. The traditional way of working was more bureaucratic, where a lot of information would be hidden amongst the stakeholders. Transparency means that everything is visible and nothing is hidden. This applies to every role, artifact, and event in the Scrum framework and in general across the organization where Scrum is being used and enacted. Strategies, goals, objectives are clearly visible and understood. It is not that strategies are known only to the topmost body in the organization, but every employee should be aware of it. All interactions and conversations between the roles should be open and transparent. All planning work and work progress should be visible and transparent. A good example of this transparency is the work done daily by the technical team. They commonly work in open spaces and collaborative spaces, with posted sprint and progress charts visible to all the team members as well as other passers-by, meaning they may be on the walls in the form of posters which are visible from a good distance. And this is where transparency connects to the concept of empirical process control, which means work needs to be transparent and visible, and actual work results are the only true measure of progress. Decisions and functions are fact-based and experience-based and evidence-based. Then we have the next one, which is inspection. Monitoring and evaluation of the product and process to ensure that the project conforms to established requirements. Inspection refers to review and inspection. It goes hand in hand with transparency. All the transparent and visible artifacts, events, and role activities need to be reviewed and inspected and understood. The actual results and the progress towards goals and objectives are used to gather lessons learned and to drive continual improvement. Inspection needs to be balanced and done at appropriate times. It should not be so frequent that it gets in the way of the work, and also not so far between that there is no time to be agile and adjust to changes. A good example of inspection occurs at the end of a sprint event. The completed work is demonstrated and inspected by the customer, all stakeholders, and the entire Scrum team. This is an inspection of the product, not the process of Scrum, but the product increment which is being created by the team, based on their understanding from the product owner who represents the customer. Then we have the adaptation. Adaptation follows after inspection. Improvements and changes are made quickly to minimize problems. Adaptation is about being flexible, adjusting, being agile. Adaptation is making changes as needed and when needed, based on the inspection of the actual transparent progress and results. You see, this is how the adaptation combines with inspection and transparency. It is about a continual alignment with strategies and objectives and making continual improvement as well as achieving efficiency and effectiveness. A prime example of adaptation occurs during the sprint event. The development team may have been working with a customer stakeholder to develop a specific requirement. The development may be nearing the completion stage when the customer realizes they need to modify the requirement and make significant changes. This is an example of adaptation based on some new knowledge or learning by the customer in this case. And that triggers adaptation by the development team as well. So that was a brief introduction to the Scrum framework. Scrum relies on transparency. Decisions to optimize value and control risk are made based on the perceived state of the artifacts. To the extent that transparency is complete, these decisions have a sound basis. To the extent that the artifacts are incompletely transparent, these decisions can be flawed, the value may diminish, and risk may increase. Therefore, transparency of artifacts is essential in Scrum. The Scrum Master's job is to work with the Scrum team and the organization to increase the transparency of the artifacts. The Scrum team means the developers in particular. This work usually involves learning, convincing, and change. Before we finish this module, number 3, let us do one sample question. This question actually combines module 2 and 3. Question number 3. When the Scrum team learns through transparency and inspection, this is an example of A, project management, B, monitor and control, C, performance management, and D, adaptation, or adaptation, that is. You might recollect the three pillars of Scrum are transparency, inspection, and adaptation. So please think about which is the correct answer here. Know that the question is about learning through transparency and inspection. Therefore, once inspection is done, it is about adjusting based on the learning, and that is known as adaptation or adaptation. Therefore, the correct answer would be option D, that is adaptation, and not the others, which are project management, monitor and control, or performance management. Well, B, monitor and control, does connect to inspection though, but that's not the right answer. And that brings us to the end of module 3. And you can see that we are gradually getting there. We are starting small, taking small steps before we dig deeper into the Scrum framework, into the various roles, artifacts, and events, and other things such as the Scrum-based planning, the various planning layers, and eventually we will end up with the scaling of Scrum to larger teams and larger products. While we have covered one question, which was really about module number 2, but there was some information in module 3 for that question to be answered correctly. We will do the questions on module 3 and 4 together at the end of module 4, because these two modules 3 and 4 are important because they together cover 10 questions in the exam. But most of the question would be from module 4 rather than module 3 for those 10 questions. Thank you.